Today is May 30th, 2017, and I'm here with Father Hendry. Thank you for being here. So my first question for you is, what led you to a religious life?
It's a long story. So, as a kid, I always liked going to Mass. And this one church we used to go to when I was, up until I was 5, when we moved out of New Jersey, had this really nice stained glass behind the altar, and it just really seemed kind of special. I went to a Catholic grade school, and I was an altar boy, and the pastor could always come by the school and take the altar boys out to lunch. And I thought, what power, he can override the principal of the school and just take people for lunch. And he was great, and we had a good time. And then when I was in high school, I went to a Jesuit high school. I mean, I thought about being a priest. Like I thought about being a scientist, and actually I did. So it's a possibility. When I was in high school, I was impressed by the spirit of the Jesuits, especially the young guys, that seemed to be really alive, both intellectually, socially, religiously. I went to college. I went to a Jesuit school, and every year I thought about becoming a Jesuit. Every year I decided not to. And there was a Jesuit I used to talk with. He was a psychologist. And I guess you'd say he was a spiritual director. And I would talk with him about it, and every year he told me that he thought I made a really good decision. And I had reasons. I got involved in student government. I'd fallen in love. I'd made some commitments, especially my senior year when I was student government president. And so I wanted to follow through on all the commitments. And so I couldn't do both at the same time. I went to grad school, actually at Michigan State. And I was in grad school. I was 21 years old, and I felt like, while I liked physical chemistry, I felt like it was narrowing me down a bit, and I wasn't quite ready for that. And so I felt like I wanted to do something where I'd be happier. So one night I was in the library in the chemistry building, and I thought, let me figure this out. I'm feeling too conflicted at this point. So I decided to walk home, and I walked down, I don't know if you're familiar with Michigan State's campus, but the Red Cedar River flows through the campus. And I walked down the middle of the river. It was February, so it was frozen. And I've joked ever since that I decided to become a Jesuit priest while I was walking on water. But I started, and this is the most logical prayer I've ever made. I started thinking, okay, what do I need to be happy? And I felt like I needed to do something that involved God, something that involved liturgy, connected with God. I needed to do something that put me in touch with people on the inside where they really live their lives. And I felt like I needed to do something that would improve society. This was 1968, the year after the race riots in 67. So then I started thinking, okay, what would I want to do? I was in grad school in physical chemistry. I could stay inside. I could go to med school. I've got a scientific background. And I thought, no, that's really my brother's dream. That's not really mine. And that's not the level of connection I want. And I've been involved in student politics. I always read a lot of stuff about politics. I've been on the debate teams. And I thought, I could go into politics. I can go to law school. And I thought that still didn't give me the connection I wanted to have with people. Although I've seen a lot of lawyers since who do have good connections with folks. And so I thought, I could be a priest, right? And that seemed to resonate the best. And then I started thinking, what kind of a priest should I be? And I thought I liked the parishes. I liked the parishes where I grew up. I thought the priest did a good job getting to know families and really fostering a sense of community. But I also remembered a conversation that I had when I was a senior in high school. I was on the speech team. We were a Jesuit all-boys school. There was an all-girls school that was run by the Religious of the the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. And their moderator was a Sister Philip Mary, who liked me. It came in handy because when we'd be away on debate trips, if the girls asked to go to a party with us, she'd always say no. But if I asked her for the girls to come to the party with us, she'd always say yes. It was immensely helpful for my popularity because girls would always ask me, "Si, you talk to Sister Philip Mary?" Well, anyway, over time we got to know each other, and my senior year, we were hosting a debate tournament, and I was walking between rounds somewhere. She stopped me and she says, "What are you going to do next year?" I said, "Well, I've got an academic scholarship to Spring Hill College. I want to study science. I want to study physics." And she says, "Why don't you think about becoming a Jesuit priest?" Out of the blue. I says, "Why?" She said, "Well, I think being a Jesuit would give you scope to develop all the aspects of your personality." And so I thought, well, this might be a good way to, to both follow this idea of being a priest, but also at the same time develop a lot of different parts of me. I wanted to be as alive as I could be.
Great. So I know you already kind of answered this question, why did you choose the Jesuits, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
That's basically it.
All right, great.
I had gone to we had Jesuit priests come to our parish, celebrate Mass. I went to a Jesuit high school. I went to a Jesuit college. I was brainwashed early.
All right, great. You also kind of talked about this a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about your formation and academic background?
Well, keeping with that theme of trying to develop all the parts of myself, I started out in physics, ended up getting a degree in chemistry with a minor in English literature. Because I liked reading, I liked what literature did. I felt like it made me more human. So I had that background. When I joined the Jesuits, our first 2 years are a novitiate. It's mostly focused on spiritual formation, getting to know something of the history and the Institute of the Society of Jesus. And I can tell you more about that later. We also had some academic parts of that. But then the next year I studied philosophy for a year at Loyola University in New Orleans. And I studied a good bit of psychology at the same time. Now, to be a priest in the Catholic Church, you need to have 39 hours of philosophy. But at the time, I'd been through a Jesuit college, and we had required 18 hours of philosophy. So I had less to take than other people did. And so we were supposed to spend 2 years there, because they wanted the social community formation to go on at the same time. But when I finished, the second semester there, I'd taken a number of philosophy courses. The guy who was a mentor for me, a Jesuit priest, said, "Si, there's nothing here for you to take. We could do individual reading if you want." And I was lucky. Since I didn't have a lot of required stuff, I did a couple of reading courses with a man named Don Jelpe, which were marvelous. We did a reading course on the modern philosophy, did one on contemporary philosophy, did one on Bernard Lonergan, did one on Alfred North Whitehead. Some people. Now I also ended up taking a course in American philosophy from Jelpe, who introduced me to Josiah Royce and Charles Sanders Peirce, whom are some of my favorite philosophers. Other people have. I have favorite ball players too, but I have favorite philosophers. So I really felt like I came alive that year. But then I worked for a while as a Jesuit novice at our high school in Houston, and the high school in Houston went bankrupt. Long story, which I don't think you need to have that recorded. I can tell you about it if you want. But the way that the Society of Jesus helps out its institutions is not by giving them a lot of money, but by sending people. And so they asked me if I could finish up early, instead of staying for 2 years, if I could finish up early and go to Houston, which I did. So I wrote my position papers, defended them in an oral exam in the summer, and then went to Houston in the fall. Fast forward, I studied theology in Chicago. Chicago was developing a new program that was, first of all, had small communities, and the communities were about reflecting on what it meant for them to become priests, which was a great environment to become a priest in. An older Jesuit had said, "Why don't you think about Chicago?" I hadn't been thinking about Chicago. The urban environment, and they were very big on integrating your academic and your ministerial work. So when you planned your courses, you met with an academic and a ministerial advisor. So there was a whole process of integrating that I really liked, so that your ministerial work would raise questions for you academically. Another Jesuit, a good friend of mine, and I wanted to get to know the urban African American experience, and so we ended up working in a cluster of parishes. And then what we would do is we would get people from the parishes together, and We'd invite one of our professors down, and we'd have this long conversation about, okay, we'd have the guy who taught church, ecclesiology, meet with people doing different things about what's really the church. How do we understand church? And it wasn't just academic, it was involved getting our hands dirty at the same time. When I don't know how much of my history you want. When I finished there, I ended up working for another year or so on the south side of Chicago. But then I went to our spirituality center in Grand Coteau, Louisiana. I directed retreats for a year and worked with divorced Catholics and remarried Catholics in the Lafayette Diocese. My focus was on spirituality. And what you'll find, and this may lead into some of your other questions, but it explains some of my academic background, that it's been a pilgrimage to work on the integration of spirituality and social justice. And that's been kind of the theme for a lot of my work. Long story short, I'll fast forward. I went to graduate school in the early 1990s in Berkeley, California, and I went to the Graduate Theological Union and the University of California, working on the integration of spirituality and social justice. There was a theologian, Don Jelpe, who had actually worked with me when I studied philosophy, and there was a sociologist named Robert Bella that I had gotten to know, and I went there to work with both of them. Ended up doing my dissertation on the integration of spirituality and justice that takes place in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And I had worked with them for a number of years. And I can say more about that later when you ask about how my work changed. But when I was asking the questions about integrating spirituality and justice, what I discovered is that they're already integrated. We've separated them. We've separated them because we often have an individualistic notion of spirituality based on an individualistic notion of the human person. And so I spent a lot of the academic part of this looking at more social understandings of the human person. And then when I did the dissertation, I looked at the experience that leads somebody to have a more social understanding of themselves as a human being and their spirituality before God. So the academic part for me has become much more integral rather than like a specific academic field.
All right, great. So
I hope I didn't lose you on that.
Oh, no. So my next question kind of goes along with that. What led you to your role at University of Detroit Mercy then?
I got fired from Loyola University in New Orleans.
Oh.
After I finished my degree, I got hired at Loyola in New Orleans to run a thing called the Jesuit Center. It was really the mission and identity office for the university, but with a number of other different elements other than what we have here. And the president who hired me ended up resigning after about a year and a half. They brought in a transition president, and then they hired another president. So within about 4 years, I worked for 3 different presidents. Then we had Hurricane Katrina, and my office ended up coordinating the efforts of Loyola with Catholic Charities, in some of the cleanup and pickup and rehab of the city. The president would come up with a whole lot of different plans for the university. He didn't always go public about them. It's a long, long story. But I disagreed with him a few times. And he ended up firing me. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of those who lost their jobs are doing really well. But there were a number of people who were maybe more outspoken or people that just didn't quite fit what he wanted for the university. So I remember things looked rather strange. And I called 2 people to get some advice from. I called Don Jelpe, who has been my mentor and my dissertation director. And Don's comment to me was, "Get the hell out of there." I said, out of the university, out of the parish, out of New Orleans, or out of the province? He said, all of the above. I called John Stoudenmeyer, who's been a long-term friend, and I explained the situation, and John says, "Do you want another job?" And I said, "No, I'm not looking for another job. I want to make sense out of this one." He said, "I can't help you with that at all." He said, "But we need somebody to run the Catholic Studies program." somebody that they thought was going to do it couldn't come or chose not to. So he said, why don't you, write to Stockhausen, write to the provost, apply for the job. So I did. Sent him my resume. And, I also asked John, I said, when do you need somebody? He said, tomorrow, September, Christmas. Okay. So I came up and I interviewed with a number of people. I did a little presentation to the faculty. I got a tour of the city, some great conversations with folks, and they offered me the job. My provincial wanted me to work in a parish in New Orleans, which I have nothing. When I first decided to join the Jesuits, I wanted to work in parishes, but we didn't have any room for them. We had too many people working in parishes. Now we've gotten rid of parishes. We've closed a few or gave them to the different orders because we didn't have enough people to run the parishes. So things changed a bit. But this was a parish that the province wasn't sure they were even going to keep. And so this is the way the Jesuit system works, which I really like. We really believe in obedience, but we also believe in representing, saying this is what I want, this is what I might need to do. And every year the provincial comes around and has a conversation with each person about what's going on with their life and how they're doing and whatever. Well, some of the Jesuits up here thought it'd be better if I came up here. And so they went and talked to Father Wright, who was the rector at the time, who talked to Father Scullin, who was the provincial, who wrote to my provincial and said, Detroit Mercy could really use somebody like Cy. If they offer him a job, I would like to ask you to think about letting him come up. And that's what happened. So our governance system is really very human, although the provincial still has, the final say. He holds the high cards. But it's a very human kind of a governance.
Wow, great.
Again, I'm probably telling you more than you want to know.
No, not at all. So my next question you kind of hinted at, but how has your ministry changed over the years?
I hadn't planned on working in high schools. So when I finished philosophy, the Houston needed somebody to work in the school. And so I did it as out of response. What's funny, I taught high school for 3 years. I taught high school sophomores. It was fun. A little rocky at the beginning, but overall it was fun. And later on, I've said probably the thing that has helped me most in teaching at a university is not so much my PhD and my research, but having taught high school. I studied theology. When I studied theology, I mostly worked in spirituality and ministry with adults and ministry with the African American community. We got a new provincial. Although when I finished and I worked at our spirituality center, we had a new Jesuit provincial who had the idea that young people should work in high schools. That's where our governance system doesn't always work well. He has his own idea of what's supposed to happen. And so I ended up working at the high school in Tampa, Florida, and having a great time. There were two really good spiritual directors. We had a little seminar ourselves. We'd discuss cases, we'd read. And then I ended up, in addition to running the theology program at the school, the religion program, I ended up as chaplain for the school and director of the community service program. So I'm back doing integration of spirituality and justice. They then asked me to be superior of the high school in Houston, where I had taught as a scholastic. That was a little more complicated. But while I was there, I ended up working with the Jesuit volunteers and the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. It happened kind of funny. I was driving a van with my stuff in it from Tampa to Houston. I stopped off in New Orleans at Loyola and had a Coke in the snack bar with two good Jesuit friends, Tony Fronhart, who was doing prison ministry, and George Lundy, who was running an institute for it's an institute for social justice, basically. So we're having the Coke, and George said to me, "Si, you've always been interested in spirituality and justice. Why don't you get on JVC's board? They're really struggling with that." I said, "Come on, George, how do I get on the board?" He says, "I bring your name up at the next meeting." He was on the board. And I said, "Well, where do they meet?" He said, "Houston." I said, "Okay, I can do it." Well, then I ended up on the board got to know the volunteers who were just, I thought, superb people. And then I worked with a couple of different communities and a number of different aspects of the governance on the board. And then after 3 years, the director resigned. And so they wanted to have another Jesuit. My provincial, different provincial at this point, suggested that I throw my hat in the ring. So actually he suggested it pretty strongly. And the place was in a bit of a crisis. And I wasn't that happy where I was. And when he said to me, why don't you think about doing it? So we talked about it for a while. And I said to him, how about if I take it for 3 years? And at the end of 3 years, let's look at it, and we'll see if I've made a significant impact, if I'm happy and if the board's happy. And he said, no. He said, why don't you take it for 3 years, and if you can't turn it around, let's shut it down. Then he grinned and said, no pressure. But I ended up talking with a fellow teacher who was a good friend of mine, who actually had become principal. And Richard said to me, he says, you're really best when you can grab onto something and really build something. And he says, here you can build it without having to tear anything down. It's kind of falling apart already. So, and this is only JVC in the South. It was not JVC nationally. And so I did it and I loved it. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep, but we really built something, and I loved it. And so when I started looking for, after 5 years of that, I got invited to run their international program. And got to their interview, got to the final two. I was one of the final two. And the guy that they hired actually was somebody who had international experience, which I didn't have. He was a Jesuit that I've known for quite a while. And so this was during an election season, actually. And so they asked me what I thought. I said, I think you guys should hire Dave. Meanwhile, Dave said to him, I think you should hire Si. And they couldn't get over that. The two of us would see the other guy as really good. But they hired him, mostly because of his international experience, which I thought was good. But I kidded him for years that his board listened to me more than it listened to him. But then I also, Spring Hill College, where I had gone, was needing a new president, and a friend of mine was on the board, liked what I had done with JVC, and suggested I apply to be a president. I didn't have a PhD. So I applied and got to be one of the final 3 candidates. And at this point, I'm thinking, but I didn't get it. So I started thinking, well, what would I really want to do? I think I've done something good here. I think I've got some possibilities. So after orientation the next year for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, I borrowed a friend's cabin on a lake in northeast Georgia. Decided that I would fish for my protein. It was good. They had a lot of fish in the lake. And then I would walk and pray and try to figure out what I wanted to do. It just came to me that, why not just follow up on the interest in spirituality and social justice and do a serious study of it. So I came back and looked around and decided to apply to grad school. Now, I had been given talks in parishes about this, and I felt like I'd gotten about as far as I could on my own. I needed something more professional, and ended up going to Berkeley. Went to the Graduate Theological Union and the University of California to work with Jopi and Bella. Finished that, and then got hired at Loyola to run their Jesuit Center. And then got fired from that. And I didn't really feel like I could take a Catholic Studies program, and this is funny. I'd refused a number of Catholic Studies programs before because I never felt like I was Catholic enough. I don't know if you want to print this or not. But the program here had 3 foci: spirituality, social justice, and Vatican II, all 3 of which mattered to me a lot. So I took a mini sabbatical and I went to Berkeley and talked to a number of professors and read everything I could on the whole idea of Catholic studies. And so I came back here to develop the program. And I got here on New Year's Eve, 2006. And I've loved it.
Great, yeah.
I really like the student body. I really like the faculty, and I really like the Jesuit community, and I really like the city of Detroit.
Cool.
So,
All right, so my next question is, how has your relationship with God evolved throughout your life as a Jesuit?
that's a tougher one. No, it really is. It's probably paralleled my own development as a human being. I think when I entered, I was idealistic. I was trying to make myself be a certain kind of person. I'm going to be a great Jesuit, going to do all kinds of wonderful things. And over time, I think I've become more comfortable being who I am. That doesn't mean I'm not trying to develop or trying to do things. And my prayer used to be structured. My prayer now is, I get up in the morning, come downstairs, get a cup of tea. And in the summertime, I pray in our courtyard. In the wintertime, I pray in one of the little parlors here. And sometimes I pray in this comfortable chair I have in my bedroom. And I just sit there and talk with God. I'll pay attention to how I'm feeling, and we might talk about that. Sometimes I just kind of sit and look at nature. I think when I was younger, when I was in the novitiate, I always prayed in the church, in the chapel. I think I've seen God much more in the rest of my life. I still set aside time to pray. But I think my relationship with God was much more individual. It was me and God. And I think over time, I've really developed a sense of the way God's connected with the rest of my life and with the people in my life. I remember reading Pope Francis saying that a lot of his prayer had to do with memory and with people. And there's a lot of people who've, I think, helped me see God in a different way because of them and how they live. Part of the reason I became a priest was to celebrate Eucharist, and I see God's connection in and through Eucharist. At various points in my life, God the Father was more important. At other points, Jesus was more important. And I would say now I tend to think I see God mostly as a Trinity. And I think that's really what we're talking about as Christians. Not that the Father is less important than he has been, or not that Jesus is less important. Jesus is still a strong focus. And that's something that has developed over time. But I see more of the togetherness of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that, again, connects then with my relationship with God. I relate to God differently. But it's tied into everything else that are some of the further questions. I remember when I was first as a novice, I would pray from Scripture, and I'd still pray from Scripture, but I would, focus on that. And then one of the things that happened in my novitiate was my father had a stroke, and I went down to Florida both to pay attention to his health, but also to get a job and earn some money to keep food on the table for the family. And there's all kinds of complications in my family and everything else. And I would discover that I would take some time and go walk by the lake near our house and just kind of sort through what I was feeling and what I needed to do about different situations. And I remember telling the man that I used to talk with when I was in college, who was a Jesuit, about that my prayer was different. I wasn't quite sure if I was really praying well or not. And he said, no. He says, you're praying like a Jesuit, which I thought was really good. So there's a sense in which what matters to me as a Jesuit is the whole sense of discernment, is to pay attention to, I'm doing this wrong, keep focusing on you guys rather than looking at the camera. Is that okay? Okay. Ignatius's real contribution to the church, I think, has to do with discernment, which means paying attention to the way that God deals with each person, of paying attention to the movements within ourselves, the consolations, the desolations, the good spirit, or what he calls the enemy of our human nature. And that has been pretty much what often goes on in my prayer, as I'll be paying attention to what's happening in my life and how it's affecting me. Now I might think about this later and analyze it later, but I won't be doing that while I pray. But somehow the prayer is much more being present to God and what's going on in me. I don't know if that's helpful. It's a little, it's really hard to put into words.
Yeah.
But I think the key Jesuit thing for me is discernment. That's probably one of the best things we do for ourselves. But discernment is tied in with the whole sense of keeping my focus on God and keeping my focus on Jesus. And one of the things I do here is I haven't the last 2 years because of some other reasons, but I would take a group of about a dozen faculty and administrators through Ignatius' spiritual exercises. And we would take the academic year to do it. And what happens is we end up talking about discernment and how we kind of sort things through. Provides a good framework for living and making decisions.
All right.
Okay.
Great. No, yeah. So my next question is, can you tell us about an experience that informed your ideas about social justice?
Yeah, I thought about this one. There's a lot of things, but I would say probably the thing that infected it the most was my experience working in the African American community in Englewood in Chicago. There was another Jesuit, and like I told you, we were trying to get to know the urban African American experience. And we developed a program to develop leadership around liturgy and different roles in the parish. And we worked there for a couple of years, and I got to know the community. But what was interesting, I got to know the community not so much as me helping them and doing something for them down here, but as people who were tied into things together. A real sense of mutuality developed. Now, I could never really be a part of the community in a lot of ways, but there's a sense that we were in this together mutually. They taught me how to be a priest. The way they paid attention to each other taught me how to be a priest. There's Loyola University in New Orleans has a poverty law center, and the law center had a poster that had a white hand and a black hand grasping each other. And the line, the wording on it said, "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your freedom is bound up with mine, then let's work together." And that's how I felt. The community there taught me that. That who I was and my own growth was tied up with who they are and their own growth. I also discovered that we often debate things about how ministry should be and whole ideas about justice. But I discovered that I needed to work with people individually and to help people also take responsibility, but at the same time work with the structures in our society that keep people from being free. So it's both a personal and a structural type of ministry, and they taught me that. So, social justice is, the families and the people that I knew there. When I was in grad school in Berkeley, there was a homeless guy that I got to know. He used to go around and wash windows of cars, and ask people for $1. But we would sit and talk. I gave him some money, but most of the time we would talk. When he got some money, he would take me out for a cup of tea. So homelessness became Wayne Tyler. It wasn't a lot of abstract ideas. So I think Wayne was somebody that helped social issues become concrete and personal. But mostly the thing that really formed me was the same thing that formed me as a priest, which was the community at St. Bernard's Parish in Chicago. It's no longer St. Bernard's. They merged about 5 parishes. It's now St. Benedict the African, and So.
All right.
But this community at the time didn't even have a church. The church had burned down. The diocese wasn't giving them the money yet to rebuild. So we had a big room in the school, and that was it. But it was alive. It was alive. The community would celebrate well too. So I learned that celebration, and hope were part of social justice too.
Okay, great.
Okay, start.
Yeah, no. So my next question is, how does the Jesuit charism influence your work?
I would say what I said before about
Yeah.
spiritual, about discernment. One of the things about the Jesuit charism that I've discovered over time, I think when I first came in, I wanted to do a lot of things myself. And I've discovered that our work is really communal. We really focus things as a community of people. And so I see it, that I see all kinds of different people have different skills and make different contributions. So that together we do a lot. So there's a certain togetherness that's involved with it for me.
Okay, yeah. So my last question is, how do you see the Society of Jesus and the Church changing in the future?
Well, for one, anything I answer is not going to be very good because I really can't see the future.
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, that might be trite, but there's something to that. I couldn't have predicted my own future. I couldn't have seen that I would end up in Detroit. I have to tell you, there have been 3 or 4 times in my life when I've seen things and decided, well, I don't want to go there. First time I saw this place was in the mid-1970s when they had like a chain link fence around it, and the buildings were all dark gray. And I thought it was really depressing. They've since pressure washed them. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is a really dingy place. I'm not sure I'd want to go there. But I said the same thing about Chicago when I'd gone through Chicago, and I thought, no, I'd never want to go there. And I'm studying theology there and finding it really marvelous. So my first reactions are not always the most indicative of what's best for me. But I'll tell you more about the church first, and then I'll talk about the society. I really like Vatican II. Vatican II happened, it started when I was in high school and finished when I was in college. And it was a time of real excitement. I was lucky. I was part of a group called the Sodality in high school, and the guy who was moderator got 5 of us to research different areas of the church in Vatican II. So we would go around and do presentations in parishes. High school kid, okay? But I got into what the thing was about. And a lot of my friends in college, we were following Vatican II and getting excited about documents that came out. And there was a real energy to it. And I felt a lot since then that the church kind of either lost some of the energy or even backtracked on some of it. But I find Pope Francis being the first pope I've been excited about since John the 23rd. He's got the flavor of Vatican II. He's got the flavor of focusing on people. He's got a flavor of, the church as the people of God. He's got the flavor of paying attention to the needs of people more than to imposing rules. I think he's got a sense of spirituality that really informs who he is. I think he's somebody who also loves Jesus. So I see the church, if Francis moves, his approach moves forward, as being a really dynamic influence in our world. But I see it looking different because his charism isn't so much paying attention to things as they've been. I mean, you've also got to take a look at the fact that you've got fewer priests. And I think that may help the church become more of a lay church, a church of the people, more than just a church of the hierarchy. And so you've got more of a development of that. So I think that with fewer priests, it gives lay people more of an opportunity to make a contribution and to take responsibility. And I think Francis fosters that, so I can see that happening. Francis also fosters the church paying attention to the poor, so that what you've got is a development of a church that cares deeply about justice. So, I see that as something really positive. Now, I don't know, the next person they elect might be, a throwback to pre-Council of Trent. I don't know. I doubt it. And part of the reason that I think that is that, from what I can tell, Francis was kind of like got the second most votes when Benedict XVI was elected. So when it came around for Francis, or for the next election, I think the Cardinals knew what they were getting, and I think they didn't want business as usual. I think they wanted something different. So I think there's enough movement internationally, for the developments of the church being kind of a Vatican II church. I also think it's really fascinating that you have Pope Francis, all right, who's not European. You've got a much more international church. Vatican II kind of hints at that the direction of the church would be much more global, rather than Eurocentric. And in the process, I think Francis is trying to do it. So, but just even the fact that he's there makes it more of an international church. So I see that happening. And once we do that, then the church takes on a different flavor. Because a lot of the celebrations in the church and a lot of the rituals are very European. Okay. Society of Jesus. When I entered the Society of Jesus, a lot of things were very rigid and very structured. That was the church. But what I've seen happen over time is it's become much more personal and much less rigid. And I've seen the authority structure. Now maybe it's because I've gotten older, but I've also been a superior, so I have a sense of how I wanted to operate, so that it's much more human and much more fluid. At the same time, it still has the authority. So I see the church moving much more, in the line of Vatican II. One of the things that I think the Society of Jesus does contribute to the church is the intellectual capacity we have. I tend to think we help Catholics be thinking believers. So I hope we continue to do that. I get a little concerned because we're having trouble keeping a lot of our universities going well. So I don't know what the future of our universities is going to be. I don't have any difficulties with lay people being in charge, like Garibaldi being in charge of the university. But there's some other places where I think it's hard to maintain financially. So I wonder what our future is going to be. I see a lot of younger Jesuits being very interested in theology, but I don't see a lot of younger Jesuits being interested in a lot of other academic fields. So like, the Jerry Albrights who teach biology, or the, folks like that. I don't know if we're going to have people that really, take their place. One of the things I like about this university is you've got a Jesuit in just about every college. So you've got, a couple of Jesuits in liberal arts, Rafe Shen, Justin Kelly, myself. You've got Jerry Kavanaugh in business. You've got Jerry Albright in sciences. You've got Gilbert Singera in architecture. And there's something about bringing the Jesuit vision of finding God in all things and helping people discern in different fields that I think really makes things alive. I'm hoping we can continue to do that, but I don't always see that many younger guys doing the different fields. What I do see is what Gilbert actually calls the hybrids of people who are part academic and part pastoral, and they're doing both. And so in a sense, they're developing that integration of the pastoral and the academic, kind of like my academic program in Chicago was trying to do. And I see that, and so I see kind of an increased sense of integration in our world, and maybe that's where the influence will come. I also see us becoming more international. Arturo Sosa is Latin American. He's the first Jesuit superior from the Americas. His predecessor, Adolfo Nicolas, spent most of his time in Asia. So you're having a lot more international influence, and that shifts the mentality. So I see, I don't know, in a sense, I guess my overall sense is I'm excited about the future for the Society of Jesus and for the church. Society of Jesus, I think you find that flavor of Ignatius kind of suffusing the whole thing, no matter what culture. You find people, continuing to discern, continue to be dedicated to Jesus. in all kinds of different ways. And so there's a lot of different variety of apostolates. I think sometimes we focus too much on just schools, but now you've got all kinds of different things going on.
All right. Well, that was my last question. But is there anything else you'd like to add that you feel you weren't able to answer in these questions?
I'd like to find out any other questions y'all have and make this more of a conversation.